And frankly, if I was them, I would want a nuclear weapon because they would compare themselves to North Korea, which is not being attacked. And they realize that if they did have a nuclear weapon, they probably would never have been attacked. So this is a regime that's going to go for a nuclear weapon as soon as this war ends. There are rumors that President Trump has told Israel that this war has to end within a week, that the Iranians, this regime, has more a higher tolerance, higher threshold for pain than either the Americans or the Israelis.
Hello and welcome. The war in the Middle East has entered a second weekend and there are no signs of the air attack stopping. The US and Israel have not stated their final goal to end the war, and Iran's new supreme leader has vowed to take appropriate revenge for the killings. To discuss this, Professor Barnard A. Haykel is joining me from New York. He teaches Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, and much of his research lies at the juncture of the intellectual, political, and social history of the Middle East. Professor, good to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Professor, it's being said that in 15 years, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has for the first time convinced an American president to go to war against Iran. Do you agree with this?
I mean, I think that the Prime Minister of Israel had a role to play in this, but, you know, President Trump made his own decision based on his own analysis and assessment of Iran, and he has a long history of antagonism and animosity towards Iran. So I think this was primarily an American decision, and just to blame it on Israel or the Prime Minister, which is often the case now in social media especially, is incorrect.
All right. And the imminent threat that Washington has spoken about, how much truth do you think there is in it?
I don't think there was an imminent threat of an Iranian attack on American forces in the Gulf. I think what prompted this attack was the fact that the regime in Iran was extremely weak. Its air defenses had been destroyed last year in the 12-day war. And there was an opportunity to establish a new relationship with the Iran regime. I think President Trump was largely influenced by the example of Venezuela, and he thought that he could do the same in Iran. He saw Iran as another oil-rich country with whom he could strike a deal with a more moderate leadership. That was his hope. And it was a major miscalculation because, Venezuela and Iran are very different countries, and the regime in Iran is an implacable enemy of the United States and is very ideological, unlike the Venezuelan regime.
You called it a miscalculation. Do you think the American government did not think this through?
Yeah, I don't think they fully thought through the reaction of the Iranian regime, and that the Iranian regime was willing and ready to engage in a war of attrition, which is what we're in right now, and that would target oil installations and that would essentially freeze and all shipping out of the Persian Gulf, which would cause a global energy crisis and a global economic crisis. That's what the Iranian regime is now aiming to do.
What was the United States administration hoping would happen in Iran? And now that it has not gone the same way, how are they recalibrating to the new normalcy?
Well, as I said, they were hoping that they would have a Venezuela-like outcome where there would be a new agreement between a more moderate leadership in Iran and the United States, and that would then lead to removal of sanctions and the flow of American investments, and especially American oil companies, into Iran to help boost energy production. President Trump was, politically educated in the 1970s when there were two oil crises in 1973 and 1979, and he thinks oil is the lifeblood of the global economy, and he wants to control that oil flow, not least because it would also help him have leverage over China. And since that has not worked out, there is no reconciliation, there's no agreement with a more moderate regime in Iran. In fact, the regime in Iran has become much more ideological, much more hardline. The Americans find themselves without easy solutions or an off-ramp for this war. At the moment, the Arab countries are trying to involve the Chinese and the Pakistanis to try to mediate this dispute. The Russians, of course, were also contacted, but the Russians are benefiting greatly from this war because it makes their own oil much more valuable. They want the continuation of this war. when it comes to Russia. Whereas I think when it comes to China, China is very adversely affected by this war because a lot of its oil comes from this region.
You said the Chinese and the Pakistanis are being contacted to mediate. How much optimism should we see that with?
I don't think that for the Chinese in particular, much more than the Pakistanis, have leverage over the Iranian regime. But I don't think the Chinese are willing to use that leverage entirely to put pressure on Iran fully. And also, I think the request will be that if China does this with Iran, then the Americans have to do this with Israel to stop the war completely. So pressure has to be exerted on Iran and on Israel, by China on Iran, by the US on Israel. And I don't think that's likely to happen. Although there are rumors that President Trump has told Israel that this war has to end within a week.
Let me push you a little more on that, because you said that China could exert pressure on Iran, and then the United States will have to exert pressure on Israel. If we see that and put two and two together, the US and China are also trying to come up with a trade deal. And there were talks, we don't know if it's on track or not, but US President Donald Trump was supposed to go to Beijing, meet with the Chinese leader. Do you think this could actually work out somehow?
Yeah, I think that, the president of the United States still is planning to visit Beijing at the end of this month in March. And they could discuss this in addition to other issues such as trade matters. But it would mean that the Americans would have to ask the Chinese for something. And it would mean that the Chinese would play a bigger role in the Persian Gulf, which they did do in March of 2023 when they mediated the dispute between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the Americans would have to accept a bigger Chinese role. And that's not something I think the Americans are happy to do at the moment. But Trump doesn't want this war to continue. He's very, very sensitive to the price of oil. He's very sensitive to a global economic recession. And he has an election in November, a midterm election, where he wants to see his party, the Republicans, win. So the Iranians know this, and they're going to basically try to create a global economic crisis and a crisis in oil prices so that President Trump feels the pressure. This is basically what's happening now. And so the Iranians want to extend this war. The Israelis, I think, also want to extend this war, whereas the Chinese and the Americans want to end this war. So the Chinese and the Americans find themselves on the same page when it comes to how and the Arab states also want to end this war.
All right, since you said that the US president had its own motives to start this war, it was not just the Israeli pressure, and you are saying that Trump wants to end this war. There are also reports coming in from CNN who have spoken to exclusively to Pentagon officials who have said that they don't seem to have any plan for the situation in Strait of Hormuz as it is playing out. Would you call it naive? Because every single Middle Eastern expert has written about this, that if there is a war with Iran, Strait of Hormuz will be weaponized.
That's right. So I think that it is astonishing that the Americans didn't think of solutions to the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz. This would involve, finding insurance companies who are willing to insure companies, boats and ships. So the Americans have offered to do some of that insurance, and then it also involves convoys, armed naval convoys that would help the ships through the strait. And I think the Americans alone cannot do this. It's not practical. It would require an international coalition to do it, and still the Iranians have thousands of speedboats. These are suicide speedboats that some of them are manned, some are unmanned, that could ram ships and blow them up. So very difficult to defend against these. Just like it's very difficult to defend against swarms of drones, which is what the Iranians are using against energy facilities, mostly in the Gulf. So yes, they haven't thought through how to defend against an asymmetric war that is being waged by the Iranians.
You spoke of an international coalition. The German chancellor has just put out a statement saying that there is no reason Berlin would consider providing military protection to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, it involves a huge commitment, and that coalition should have already been established or talked about before the war started to have a naval convoy. Or naval convoys. And again, you need a minesweeper ahead of the convoy. It's very complicated, logistically very complicated process. And the Iranians are now mining the Strait as well. So this is the big question. Really, is how long this war is going to last, what the long-term effects or on oil production is going to be, oil and gas production, because also Qatari gas has been stopped, is going to be. And if the war ends, how quickly this production can be brought back online, because there has been damage to oil facilities, storage facilities in the Gulf. And then there's also the question of these mines. How long will it take to remove them?
You make a very important point there, Professor. Let me ask you this then. What is your assessment of Iran's response to the war so far, and is it at par with what you had expected?
Yeah, the Iranians had actually basically warned that this is what they would do for many years now. I mean, there's nothing surprising in how the Iranians have reacted. Basically, they've been saying that if they are faced with an existential threat to the regime, that they will burn the entire region. And that's exactly what they're doing.
You know, hitting American military bases and embassies is one thing, because this is something Iran had said, as you also pointed out, prior to the war. Why is Iran hitting Gulf oil fields, and how is that justified?
No. I mean, the Iranians actually said, I mean, maybe not, publicly, but they've said it privately to the leaders of the Gulf that they would hit oil installations, vital installations like desalination plants. If their desalination plants were hit, as one was hit, they hit back against one in Bahrain. That they would stop, shipping in the Persian Gulf. No, they've been very clear that they would cause a global economic crisis if they are existentially threatened, and that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're an arsonist. They're a revolutionary regime that wants to burn the region in order to stay alive. That's what they're doing.
Iran's Mujtaba Khamenei used the word intiqam multiple times during his first speech as the supreme leader, which is Farsi for revenge. Professor, what could revenge really look like?
It's actually originally Arabic for revenge. And revenge it means attacking, basically causing the kind of harm to the Americans. It means attacking Americans, but also other regimes that are allied with America, of course, Israel. And also, I think they want reparations now. They're claiming that they want reparations from the Americans and Israelis for the damage that was caused to Iran. So they've basically stated and put terms that are, of course, entirely unacceptable to the Americans and to the Israelis. So now it's a game of, who has the more endurance, more tolerance for pain, the Iranians or the Americans and the Israelis. So we're now in this game, we can call it a game of chicken, who will blink first between the Iranians and the Americans and the Israelis. And I suspect, and this is just my speculation, that the Iranians, this regime, has a higher tolerance, higher threshold for pain than either the Americans or the Israelis.
Why do you think that his son is much more radical or much more hardened in its stance compared to the earlier regime?
Well, I mean, it's just we know about him. We know a fair amount about him and about his connections to the Revolutionary Guard. I mean, we just know that he is a more radical, much more kind of hardline person than his father was. That's the reputation he has, and we see this now in the statement that he put out. Now, of course, there are all kinds of rumors that he was killed, he was injured. He hasn't appeared yet, so we don't know whether it's actually he was the one who put out the statement. But what's clear is that the regime is now completely controlled and dominated by the Revolutionary Guard. This is a very hard line and radical faction of the regime that is in charge. And you can see from the targeting that they're engaged in that, they're not sort of attacking haphazardly. There's a plan and there's thought and that's going into how they're targeting, the places that they're hitting. And so it seems to me that this is a regime that's still, at least at the security and military level, still quite strong. And they have tens of thousands of drones that they still have not used.
Also, the former Ayatollah had a fatwa against acquiring any kind of nuclear weapon, something this Ayatollah has not, at least so far, said. Do you think there is a possibility that Iran could actually acquire a nuclear weapon, especially in the wake of this kind of a war?
Yeah, so this idea of a fatwa is part of Iran's propaganda. Fatwas can, a person who issues a fatwa can change his mind at any time and issue a new fatwa. There's nothing permanent about fatwas in Islamic law. So the idea that the former mullah, or supreme leader had a fatwa is really totally meaningless. It's very clear that this is a regime that has been pursuing a nuclear weapon. They wouldn't have enriched uranium to 60% enriched, level if they didn't intend to have a nuclear weapon. And frankly, if I was them, I would want a nuclear weapon because they would compare themselves to North Korea, which is not being attacked. And they realize that if they did have a nuclear weapon, they probably would never have been attacked. So this is a regime that's going to go for a nuclear weapon as soon as this war ends.
It seems like you are saying that they were attacked because they do not have a nuclear weapon.
That's right. If they did have a nuclear weapon, America and Israel would have been very careful and not attacking them because they would be afraid that they would use a nuclear weapon. And this is not a regime that this is also a regime that says it wants to destroy Israel, right? Publicly. So it's not like say Pakistan, or India that have nuclear weapons because they are part of their deterrence and their arsenal of self-protection. This is a regime that wants to attack other countries. So if they have a nuclear weapon, you would always have to wonder whether they would use it. And so you would be deterred from attacking them.
Professor, given how the war is going, do you think the Gulf states could unite and attack Iran?
I think the Gulf states are united in terms of their sense of vulnerability and they are very much against what Iran is doing by attacking them, and they put a lot of pressure on the UN Security Council to issue a resolution against Iran for its attacks on them. At the moment, the Gulf states are trying diplomatic channels. As I said, they're trying to speak to the Chinese and to the Pakistanis. They might also try to go through the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a pan-Islamic organization based in Saudi Arabia, to try to see whether negotiations can be had with the Iranians through that. But, I don't think that the Gulf states will militarily join this fight because, first, there's very little they can offer that isn't already being used by the Israelis and the Americans. And it would complicate the war if they were to join, say, with their Air Force, because the Americans would have to coordinate with them. And there's a question as to whether they're any good in terms of their military capacity and capabilities. But, if Iran escalates further and attacks, say, their desalination plants, and, these are countries that depend heavily on the desalination of seawater, then it is possible to imagine that the Gulf states would start attacking Iran.
And I want to talk about that in a little while, but you're someone who is an expert on Saudi Arabia. You have a direct line with the Crown Prince. Let me ask you this. Do you think MBS was looped in any kind of a capacity before the Americans and Israelis launched the war?
Well, I think that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia knew that this war was going to happen. He's been saying that, and he was, very fearful that this war would happen for many, many months now. So I am not sure whether he knew the exact timing of the attack. Probably not. But he was very much against this war because he was worried about exactly what is happening now, which is that Iran would try to burn the region by attacking him and attacking other Gulf countries and energy and oil installations. And this is something he didn't want. So he was lobbying very hard for the war not to happen before it did. And he's lobbying and working very hard to try to stop it now.
This is regarding a point you briefly touched before. Reuters is reporting that Riyadh told Tehran that it favors a diplomatic settlement, but if the kingdom comes under continued attacks, as it has been, it will respond in kind. Professor, talk to us a little about the military assets of Saudi Arabia and what kind of an attack we might see.
So if the Saudis decide to retaliate militarily against the Iranians, the first thing they would do is they would offer their bases and their military facilities to the Americans. So the Americans at the moment are not using Saudi facilities to attack Iran. And, if the Saudis were to give the Americans their facilities, that would make life a lot easier for the Americans because the distances are much shorter. and so the bombers and so on wouldn't have to fly so far. And the impact, the intensity of the war would increase considerably because you could then fly many more sorties and many more bombing raids and so on. So that's the first thing that the Saudis would do, I imagine. And then if they were to join themselves militarily, they have a very, very large air force. The Saudis do. I mean, numerically, many, many more planes than many other countries in the world. And this is a combination of American and European fighter jets. They have missiles that they can use, ballistic missiles that they can use against Iran. So, the Saudis have significant capabilities if they choose to use them.
Senator Lindsey Graham, who's also a very vocal Trump supporter, has been the most explicit in pressing Saudi Arabia to join the war. In fact, he said something on the lines of, why should US defend partners like Saudi Arabia when they refuse to take part in what he described as a shared struggle against Iran? Do you think there could come a point where Trump could push MBS to join the war?
I mean, he could try to put pressure on the Saudis to join the war, certainly. But as I said, I think that President Trump wants this war to end because it has very serious consequences on the American economy. So I think as the war continues, you'll see that President Trump and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia will be seeing the world and seeing this war in the same fashion, not wanting it to continue. And you will see a divergence between Israel and America. Israel wants the war to continue, whereas America increasingly will not want this war to continue. So I don't see President Trump putting pressure on the Saudis at the moment to join the war. He might put pressure to allow Saudi bases to be used by American forces. And then as far as Senator Lindsey Graham is concerned, I wouldn't take much of what he says seriously.
All right. Do you think this war changes anything between Riyadh and Washington?
We don't know. I mean, it is possible that after this war is over, that Riyadh might reassess how valuable this relationship is, whether America can defend the kingdom, whether it's, it has to kind of reassess its strategic and security arrangements. But the relationship between the Saudis and the Americans when it comes to the military and security is extremely it's of long duration. It's 80 years old, and most of the equipment, most of the training is American. So it's very hard to switch to a new kind of security or military arrangement.
Professor, what do you think would worry MBS more, if the war toppled the Iranian regime completely or left behind a wounded yet more radicalized regime in place?
So, the toppling of the Iranian regime could lead to a civil war in Iran. And a civil war in Iran would mean chaos and a failed state. And that is a country with 92 million people. A civil war could have spillover effects in the Gulf, including on Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis and other Gulf countries see the Iranians as neighbors. They may not like the regime, and they don't, but they know that they have to live with them. And so what they would like is to have a regime that is contained, that is less revolutionary, less radical, less militant, that just gets on with the business of building and developing their country and stops its revolutionary ideological activities. So I think if the choice that the Saudis are faced with is a regime that survives maybe more militant, but contained, versus chaos, they would choose the former.
Professor, you said something recently in an interview and I found it very interesting. You said, and I'm quoting you, Trump sees the Gulf as cash cows rather than men who can think. How do you think MBS views this perception?
Well, I'm sure he doesn't like it. He would rather be seen as an equal and as an ally. But Trump has his own view about the different countries, and he thinks that the Arabs, because of the 1970s oil embargo and the huge transfer of cash that happened, of money that happened in the 1970s, he sees the Arabs as basically people with a lot of money, too much money, to use his words. And that there's an opportunity for them to buy things from America and to invest in America. And, when he came to office last year, the first visit he made was to Saudi Arabia, and he tried to extract from the Saudis and the other Gulf countries trillions of dollars worth of investments in the American economy, which they said they would do, but of course never intended to actually fully deliver on.
All right, Professor Haykel, thank you so much for joining us on this show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.